The first wind that found the ridgeline that morning smelled like cold iron and old smoke. Rime clung to the switchback pines, and the gravel track up Shepherd's Spine crackled under the tires of a sun-faded pickup. At the wheel, Riona Calder kept her jaws set and her eyes forward, the way she had done since the lawyer read the will and said three impossible words: mountain, reinforced, inheritance. Riona didn't feel like an heir. She felt like a woman who fixed things no one believed could be fixed: farm winches that had ceased 2 winters ago, a bus engine that coughed black ghosts, a neighbor's combine that screamed every time it turned left. She wore her work the way others wore a name, and she squeezed the steering wheel now to hold down the restless tremor beneath her collarbone. The truck crested the last rise. What lay ahead wasn't a cabin, or a ruin, or any tidy thing that fit inside the envelope she'd carried out of town. It was a pair of concrete shoulders set into granite, a blast door crosshatched with streaks of frost and lichen. On either side, the mountain leaned in, as if it were trying to keep a secret from the sky. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Her breath plumed. The key in her pocket had a weight that felt ceremonial. She swallowed, stepped out, and the cold bit hard enough to sharpen everything. The lawyer had called it a civil defense shelter. The old-timers in town had murmured something else: bunker, as if the word might roll back a door all by itself or wake a ghost who once stood watch beneath the mountain. Riona touched the door steel. The surface stung like a bad memory. A dark smudge near the right edge could have been old grease or the skin oil of 1,000 touches. She tested the locking hub. It didn't move. She crouched, eyeing the hinge pins, the corrosion pattern, the faint, glittering grind marks on the threshold that said someone had, long ago, tried to force it and failed. People always did violence first, few tried patience. She fed the key into the cylinder. The key turned a degree and caught. She breathed out, leaned her ear against the cold metal, and listened. Inside the door, something answered with a malaise of springs and tumblers that hadn't moved in decades. She closed her eyes and imagined the mechanism the way she would: a carburetor, counter-rotating discs, a transfer cam, a set dog depressed against a pawl. She applied pressure, not to the key but to herself, slow, steady, nearly still. The tumbler surrendered one notch, then another, the way old men surrender grudges in a good winter. The final bolt gave with a sigh. The world seemed to exhale with it. Riona put both palms to the wheel and turned. The door didn't budge. She rolled her shoulder, feeling the old injury ignite, and forced herself to stop. Mechanics knew when to push and when to pry and when to rethink. She went back to the truck, grabbed a jack handle and a pry bar and a can of graphite she'd inherited from a transmission older than she was. Graphite hissed into the hinge seam. The pry bar kissed the edge of the blast door. She levered once, twice, found a groove, and thought of the man whose name was on the deed. Gunnar Vale. The town knew him as the veteran who sat outside the feed store 3 mornings a week and watched clouds pass like convoys. He never spoke about what he carried. He spoke instead about weather in tones that made you think the weather could hear him: the way a high cold sets its jaw, the way heat lies, the way wind learns the shape of a valley and keeps it. He had left Riona his bunker and a one-line note in a crabbed hand: keep what's needed alive. The door grudged open 6 inches, then a foot, then wide enough to breathe. Cold air slid out from the darkness. It smelled like dust, paper, and a garden shut away so long it had turned into a promise. Riona stepped into the seam between mountain and man-made, her cheek brushing a decal scarred by time, a blue star, a crossed wrench and lightning bolt, and a motto rubbed almost illegible. She traced the phantom letters with her glove and felt something like a hinge turn inside her ribs. The first corridor had been poured with care. Someone had troweled the smoothness with the patience of a violin maker. The floor pitched slightly toward a grated drain. On the left, a line of switches under a glass guard. On the right, a wooden pegboard with silhouettes painted where tools had once hung, ghost shapes of pliers, punch, calipers, a torque wrench stenciled with numbers. The mountain ticked as it warmed to her presence, small snaps of ice turning to water and hairline cracks. She lifted the glass, flipped the first switch. The sound in the walls was not electricity's snap but a low, raw animal waking. A generator coughed. A belt squealed. Somewhere below, a flywheel spun its first lazy inch and decided to keep spinning. Warmth moved like a nervous hand along the copper conduit. Lights faltered toward a glow. "Okay," she said to the bunker the way she would to a tractor that hadn't cooperated in years. "Show me what you are." The entry chamber lay like a throat between two vault doors. One door had been opened in her lifetime. She could see the scrape marks, the gouge where a crowbar had been laughed at by tempered steel. The other had not. Its paint was whole. Its inspection stencils were dated in a neat hand, the last one 40 years old, initialed GV. She touched the initials with the back of her glove as if they might burn. Past the open door, a hallway led to rooms that felt less like survival and more like intention. A narrow galley kitchen stocked with tins that had their own archaeology of labels. A bunk Sanhook's sleeping room with blankets folded so precisely they made her throat ache. A washroom with a basin carved from a single block of slate. On a shelf above it, a shaving brush, badger hair gone soft with age, and a straight razor wrapped in oiled cloth. She put a fingertip to the blade and nodded at the way it bit the air. Someone had kept edges here as if edges were a religion. Farther in, she found the first note. It wasn't much, a strip of masking tape on the wall above a junction box, a date, and 3 letters, all drawn with a draftsman's exactness. The letters weren't initials. They were the knotted monogram of an old signal operator, VEC, voltage, earth, continuity. It was a reminder, but also a voice. In that cramped hand, she heard a man who had not trusted memory when memory might be asked to save a life. Gunnar had spoken to strangers only in small coin. Yet here he had spoken to her in the language of care. The power steadied. The generator's tone settled into a satisfied purr. She followed the cabling into a chamber that took her breath not because of what was inside but because of what was missing. There should have been racks of MREs, water cans, a field telephone, a radio chained to an etiquette of silence. Instead there were drawers, dozens of them, each labeled in pencil, bearings, assorted, springs, torsion, fuse links, rubber grommets, hose clamps, cotter pins, thread inserts, lamp types, bayonet, screw. Not survival for a week, she thought. Survival for decades. Survival of function, of machine, of the talent to keep things moving. On the far wall hung an outline of a vehicle. It was pen on drafting vellum, pinned with brass tacks. Riona leaned close. The chassis rails were double-boxed. The suspension geometry was clever the way a river is clever. Every line looked like it had been decided by patience, long arms, low roll center, a whisper of anti-squat. At the bottom right was a title block, Rover Utility, Platform Kestrel, Rev 3C. Next to it, in the same crabbed hand, if you are reading this, you have hands I trust. Riona forgot the cold. The scuff of her boots on concrete sounded like hours. She could feel, as mechanics always can, the thing behind the drawing. Someone had built this, not on paper, not in theory. It was somewhere. The thought landed like an ember in dry weeds. She scanned the room for another door and found none. She ran her fingers along the wall where the concrete met the rock and found what she would have overlooked had she been anyone other than herself, a seam so fine you could have folded a newspaper into it and still called it tight. The seam curved. It wasn't a door so much as a pivot. She followed it left, right, up to where the corner met shadow. The mountain had been taught to tell lies. She went back to the entry and procured a drop light, a thin blade, and a stubbornness that had got her through winters when coils wandered and fuel refused to vaporize. The blade slipped into the seam. She waggled it. The blade found a pin. The pin turned. Something in the wall clicked as discreetly as an apology. The pivoted section moved as if embarrassed to be discovered. Cold air from a deeper well washed over her. The light threw itself into the new space and came back thin with its own courage. Beyond lay a workshop cut into the mountain's densest heart. It was large enough for a truck to sleep in, and a truck had, once. The tire marks had petrified into the floor varnish, for dark shadows segmented by years of sweepings. The place had a smell she knew in the first breath, cut steel and diesel tempered by lemon oil rubbed into tool handles by hands that respected both metal and skin. Benches ran the walls. Above them, orderly racks, each tool nested where it belonged. A lathe sat in the corner as self-possessed as a bull in winter. A drill press still wore the faint blush of cutting fluid at its throat. There was a welding bay behind a curtain that had turned to lace where sparks had ended their lives. She put a hand on the lathe's cross slide and felt the ghost of movement. Some machines never go to sleep, they merely close their eyes. She found the second note folded into the throat of the welding hood. If you can breathe in this mask and see through the glass, you don't need me to tell you what to do with your hands. Still, I will square your shoulders, square your work, and let the puddle talk. If your chest shakes, take one breath you can own, then make the bead that belongs to it. GV. She laughed, and the laugh surprised her. It sounded free in her own ears and frightened her with its freedom. She set the mask down like a small altar. Against the back wall was the thing the drawing had promised. The tarp that covered it had been brown once and was brown now in some older, truer way. She pulled a corner. Dust exhaled like a congregation and motes rose like prayers. Underneath, the deliberate profile of a vehicle that had never been invited to a showroom. Angular fenders cut to shed mud, a flat hood with room for hands, a cabin tall enough for shoulders and helmets. The nose was not handsome. It was honest. Between the frame rails, an engine block she recognized from the kinship of casting webs, but the ancillaries, the manifolds, the long-runner intake, those were not factory. Those were a man's second draft of a thing he needed to be better. Riona brushed her fingertips across the fender as if introducing herself. Behind the driver's door, someone had stenciled a name, faded and then repainted once, and then left alone, Lark. She said the name out loud, and the mountain approved with a small echo. For the first time since the will, she let herself imagine that inheritance might be a verb. She checked the fuel first because old habits keep you alive longer than hope. The tank smelled like it had known good discipline, stabilizer, topped off to feed no air to corrosion, a dash of something herbal that might have been a veteran's superstition. She bled the filter, watched a clean bead of amber draw a line down the cans inside, and nodded. Battery next, dead, as expected. The cables were wrapped in oiled cloth, labeled not with positive/negative but with up/down arrows and instructions to be human. She pulled the battery and hauled it to the bench as if strength itself could answer the questions that had taken up residence in her chest. Halfway through the slow coax of amps into lead, she saw the envelope. It had been tucked beneath a block of cedar as if someone had wanted it to smell like something other than paper when found. Her name was on it, written not with a shaky hand but with a hand that had become firm again for the hour it took to say one more thing. Riona. Men like me build caches to make up for our lies. Here is the only cache that mattered, the ability to continue. If your hands are on Lark, then they are already smarter than mine were when I started. Take what you need. Leave what deserves to outlast us. What lies in the deep room is for last resort and for last rites. Don't go there unless you have to. If you have to, you will know why. Gunnar Vale. She read it twice. The words last resort and last rites sat in her stomach like cold iron. She folded the note along its original crease and put it in her inner pocket the way people do with prayers when they're trying to pretend they don't believe in anything that can be folded. She spun the starter by hand to feel the engine agree. It agreed. She pulled the plugs, misted the cylinders, turned again, felt the smoothness of a rebuild that had been done by someone who knew that clearances were a poem you never finished so much as recited correctly each time. She regapped the plugs because everyone is a sinner in someone else's scripture and then put them back. She examined the belts like a friend's face, looking for cracks where absence lived. She found two. There were spares in a drawer labeled simply belts you already forgot about. She installed them, grateful for the old man's suspicion that whoever came after him would have his same human frailties. When she reinstalled the battery and cinched the clamp, a noise rolled down the mountain's throat. It wasn't mechanical. It was something older, the sound of a place remembering what it was for. She turned the key halfway. A relay clicked like a promise. She waited 3 breaths for the fuel pump to fill the long runner. She whispered, not to the machine but to the part of herself that had not yet forgiven herself for anything, and then she turned the key all the way. Lark coughed, found a flame, stumbled, then caught. The idol was high and then less so, hunting for the future. She kept her hand on the throttle like you keep a hand on a child you haven't taught to be afraid of traffic yet. The exhaust note rolled around the workshop and came back to her wearing a grin she hadn't heard from her own mouth in years. She let the engine warm and walked the perimeter, feeling for vibrations the way you feel for a mood in a room. There was a slight harmonic at 1,200 revolutions per minute, an exhaust hanger complaining about the years, and a sympathetic buzz from a gauge cluster that wanted a thin strip of felt behind it. Both could wait. The smell in the air wasn't despair anymore. It was expectation. She cut the engine before she felt tempted to drive. Temptation has its hour. The note in her pocket warmed against her with the heat the machine had shed. Last resort, last rites. The words did not let themselves be softened by joy. Beyond the workshop, past the lathe and the order and the quiet dignity of tasks finished and awaiting their turn, a narrow passage wandered toward the mountain's gut. The concrete here had a different personality, rawer, quicker, less conversational. A pipe ran along the ceiling and bled into the rock as if the mountain had grown a vein. A sign had been bolted to the wall at eye level. It did not say keep out. It said think first. She stood there a long minute. Her breath made a small cloud and then a smaller one. She could have turned back. She could have promised herself to come with someone, to wire the entry to send a signal, to make it less hers and more the world's. But the scene she had opened in the outer wall had changed more than the architecture. When you find a hinge in a mountain, you become the kind of person who looks for the next one. The passage turned twice, like a man reconsidering a confession. It ended at a door that had not been meant to be seen by anyone other than the person who said it. There was no paint on it. There were no stencils, no admonitions, no note this time in that crabbed hand to say think or stop or go with God. There was only a lock that would not answer to any key that had ever been printed for a bank or a house. The lock was disguised as an inspection plate. 4 screws. She put the driver to the first and stopped. Each screw had been torqued to a different angle. She grinned despite the cold, despite the liquid dread under her ribs. Cute, she said to a man who had been cute about very few things. She noted the angles, matched them on a scrap of paper, and recognized the language at once, degrees as numbers, numbers as letters. GVALE, she wrote, translating the rotation to an alphabet built into them. She turned the screws to neutral, then to the sequence the name demanded, then to neutral again because stubborn men like to be obeyed twice in case the first obedience was an accident. The inspection plate fell into her palm. Beneath it, not a keyhole. A slot. She went back to the workshop, lifted the cedar block again, and found a thin, flat object beneath it she'd assumed was a shim. It had the heft of a thing that had made itself important long ago and hadn't been asked to prove it again since. The plate accepted the blade. Something inside the door recognized the question and agreed to answer. There was a hiss, a sigh, and a small, decisive thunk. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed. It moved in a way no door that size should move, with the specific grace of a counterbalance that had been balanced by a woman who had lived with rollers and wire rope and gravity and made them call her by her given name. The deep room was not deep in the way of caves. It was deep in the way of promises you make to a future you won't see. The ceiling lifted higher than the workshops, and the light, when she found the switch, emerged as if unwilling to trespass. The air was colder. The quiet had another quiet beneath it, layered like varnish. Shelves ran the length of the room, and on the shelves were boxes. None were military green. None were ammunition cans. None declared their contents to anyone who lacked patience. Brown craft paper had been wrapped around each, tied with twine, labeled not with what was inside but with what the inside might someday change: water in high summer, fire when the town is thirsty, heat when the lines are down, light when all the lights belonged to someone else. Her hands shook when she opened the first. Not with fear. With an understanding that moved through her like a slow river. Inside were parts to make a pump from nothing, impeller blanks, seals, an exploded drawing of an impeller housing so simple it made tears one takes to a machine. The second held a generator's heart and limbs. The third held things that didn't look like they could belong anywhere until her mind rotated them and they clicked into the space behind her eyes like gears finally coming true. Keep what's needed alive, she whispered to the old man who had left her this room. He had not meant himself. He had meant a town. A small red light winked from the far corner. She didn't see it at first. When she did, it pulled her as a lighthouse pulls anything with a boat in it. The light sat above a box that was less modest than the others. It was not wrapped. It was a case with handles and clasps and a plate that had been polished more than once. The plate said, Vale, G, personal, do not deploy without this written order. Below that, stamped deep enough to keep time away, for last resort and last rites. There was a slot beside the plate like the one on the door. She held the thin blade and did not move. The red light blinked with the kind of patience that makes you think of living things. She looked back at the shelves. Water. Fire. Heat. Light. Machines that made more machines. Lark, asleep behind her and ahead of her. A town that had no idea it had inherited a pulse. Riona put the blade back in her pocket. Not today, she told the case. She touched the corner of it anyway, because the human hand is always a question. The corner was warmer than the air. She stood in the deep room until the cold made a map of her. Then she turned off the light, closed the door, spun the screws back to neutral, and spun them once more to say the name the mountain would keep. She walked back through the narrow confessional hallway to the workshop and then to the door she had first opened. Outside, the day had tilted toward noon. The frost had melted from the blast door hinges. The mountain had a different smell now, like someone had taken the lid off a stew that had been simmering since the last war and found it not ruined at all, merely ready. In the mouth of the bunker she stopped. The road below her lay like a ribbon too tired for a bow. The world beyond it was 3 ranches, a town that wounded itself by speaking in whispers, and a wind farm that turned with the slow adoration of prayer wheels. She could see all of it from here, how small and how brave it looked. She went back in, washed her hands at the slate basin, and watched the black swirl into the drain like a knight deciding to leave. Then she did what she had done her whole life when a machine agreed to be loved by her. She made a list. The list did not begin with Lark. It began with people. Call Webb at the feed store, tell him to order fuel filters and not the cheap ones. Ask Mrs. Harlan if she still has the hand-crank sewing machine, trade repairs for blankets. Stop by the school, ask the science teacher if the kids will help with a wind vane. Tell the firehouse about the pump parts, do not tell them where. If anyone asks why I'm buying 12 feet of radiator hose and a box of hose clamps, tell the truth, because winter lurks. When the list had the shape of a day in a week in the beginning of a season, she tucked it in her pocket next to the note and the blade. She ate a meal in the small galley, beans that tasted like they'd been canned by someone who believed in flavor as a civic duty, and a heel of bread she'd wrapped in a towel that morning, and coffee brewed in enamel that had outlived 3 sets of handles. The bunker stopped being a stranger somewhere between the second bite and the first sip. Work became easy because work always had been her language. She cleaned the exhaust hanger rattle with a shim and a laugh. She added the felt behind the gauge cluster and thought of all the times in her life she'd quieted a thing by listening to it. She greased the kingpins, set the toe by eye and by string, and replaced a cracked grommet whose failure would not have killed anything, only annoyed it to death. She ran the engine again, then shut it off before joy could trick her into carelessness. Afternoon had begun to write itself in gold letters on the ridgeline when she heard the first human sound that wasn't her own. A truck on the county road, heavy enough to be someone who lifted things and loud enough to be someone who didn't apologize for it. She froze in the aisle between tool chest and bench and felt all the warmth she'd collected rearrange itself into caution. The truck didn't turn up the switchback. It slowed on the gravel, sat in its own dust the way a big animal sits to think, then rolled on. She let herself exhale, and when she did, a different sound made it stop halfway. It came from behind the workbench, where the conduit for the outer perimeter sensors entered the wall. She hadn't touched those. She hadn't known they existed until the conduit shivered like a cat whose fur remembers rain. A small indicator lamp Riona had not noticed lit the length of a thumbnail. It winked twice, paused, winked once. She didn't have the code and didn't need it. People who watch people can tell the difference between a hello and a help even if both are done with the same eyelid. She looked toward the outer door and listened, really listened the way Gunnar Vale would have wanted her to. Far below, a second engine came up the county road and didn't slow. The pitch was wrong for ranch, wrong for volunteer fire. She knew that sound. She had heard it in the summer when out of county came to look at the wind farm and left with more questions than answers. Government had a tone when it climbed a hill, the way a man with a badge has a way of knocking on a door even when he has been taught not to scare you. There were 2 knocks on the blast door. Then a third that wasn't a knock but the sound of a gloved hand testing the seam. Riona stood very still and felt the day pause with her. She tasted iron the way you taste it when you bite your tongue to keep it from saying something it would regret later. She looked at Lark, at the lathe, at the shelves in the deep room that contained a town she had ached for without admitting it. She looked at the case with the red light through 2 walls as if seeing through rock were a thing she had always been able to do. "Miss Calder?" A man's voice came muffled through steel and frost. It was a voice that had practiced being friendly at 1,000 porch rails. It carried a paper's worth of authority and a small, real strain. "This is Ranger Nathan Brooks, State Emergency Liaison. We received a signal from this location this morning. We'd love to talk, ma'am. Just talk." 2 more knocks, polite as a teacher's. Gunnar Vale hadn't left her a guide to dealing with men who sounded polite and carried authority like a spare tire. Or maybe he had, and she'd read it without understanding. Keep what's needed alive. That might include the man outside. It might include keeping him outside. "Miss Calder, we've also got Sheriff Lane with us," the voice continued. "Folks in town mentioned you came up here today. Nobody's in trouble. We just want to make sure nobody's frozen, stuck, or, well, found something they don't know how to handle." A pause. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Mr. Vale was a good one." The line needle in her chest didn't twitch. He believed that. Or he had practiced sounding like he did. She put her ear to the door. Through it, the mountain carried a murmur of radio static in the weight shift of 2, maybe 3 men. 1 set of steps belonged to someone who favored a bad knee. 1 belonged to someone who scuffed their heels like an impatient dog. Her fingers found the wheel. The lock was still warm from the morning. She had the impulse to open because she had spent a life in small honest trades and had learned to distrust fear that didn't have a part number. The impulse lived beside another one that had the smell of cedar and graphite and someone else's last handwriting. "If you have to, you will know why." "Ma'am?" The knock this time was softer. "If you'd be more comfortable, you can speak through the door." Riona drew a breath that belonged to her and put her mouth close to the seam. "I'm comfortable," she said. Her voice sounded steadier than her spine. "This place is safe." "I'm glad to hear that," the voice said. "We'll just..." Behind the ranger's practiced tone, a second voice cut in low to a radio, too low for words and loud enough for intent. The scuff-heeled one moved 2 paces left. The bad knee took weight off his right foot. Someone thumbed the safety. The small indicator by the conduit winked again, twice, pause, once. She didn't know the code. She didn't need the translation. Somewhere in the deep room, something had heard the broadcast, or the heartbeat of men whose boots carried orders. The blast door shivered under a new kind of touch, exploratory and heavy. Men who carried authority never truly trusted a hinge unless they had installed it themselves. Riona stepped back from the door, and the cold in the entry rose up from the floor like water finding its own level. Lark clicked as it cooled. The red light in the deep room blinked once and held like an eye deciding whether to open or close. Riona reached into her pocket and felt the edge of the thin blade touch her knuckle. She looked from the door to the dark seam that led to Last Resort and Last Rites, and for the first time all day her hands didn't know which machine to love. A fourth knot came, flatter, more official, as if the mountain were being served papers. Riona tightened her grip on the wheel, felt the old injury burn, and understood that whatever she did next would choose the person she would have to be in the morning. She set her palm on the lock to turn it. And the indicator light by the conduit went steady red. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The indicator light by the conduit went steady red. Riona felt the color more than she saw it, a small decision made by a hidden system, the mountain telling her in its own grammar that the world outside had crossed from curiosity to insistence. She kept her palm on the lock, then lifted it, as if removing a hand from a friend's shoulder at the moment the friend decided to stand on their own. "Miss Calder," the ranger called again through steel and winter. "You all right in there?" "I'm listening," she said. And she was, past his voice to the way the air vibrated in the seam. Weight had settled against the doorframe, not hard enough to bruise it but hard enough to measure it. Someone had set a pry bar under the lip and tested leverage, then stopped when this much of the mountain told them no. The bad knee shifted and cussed under its breath. Boots and bones have a dialect of their own. The scuff heels eased out of discipline and back into it. "Steady red," she murmured to herself, eyes on the lamp. "That's you talking, Gunnar. I hear you." She stepped away from the door and let the cold be a barrier. The workshop light felt warmer by comparison, the lathe's patient presence, the quiet exhale of lark cooling, the order of drawers labeled with the assumption that tomorrow would exist and deserve good parts. The deep room behind the pivot door felt like a held breath. The case with the red eye watched her from memory and iron. "Ma'am," the ranger tried again, words pushed between politeness and a radio schedule, "we've got a line of weather sweeping in. If you'd be willing to just talk," the second voice supplied, lower, local, almost tender with caution. Sheriff Lane, if the ranger had told the truth. "We can do that just fine through the door." Riona bent to the conduit and lifted the small guard panel. The wire bundle was tight and hand-laced, each tie trimmed clean. She followed the tracer wire for the indicator, perimeter loop, pressure strip, a listener in the door itself, and a piggyback line that ducked through the wall toward the deep room. Steady red meant the loop had been armed, then a tamper signal had been recognized at the threshold. The system had chosen the most conservative posture it knew, lockdown with a pulse. "All right," she said, louder. "Let's do that." A hush from outside the door. Every man out there leaned a little closer to the side of his head with the ear in it. "Thank you, ma'am," the ranger said. "I'm Nathan Brooks." "Calling me Nate is fine." "Sheriff is sheriff." "We picked up an automated signal off a very old emergency grid pinging this location at 9:03. That grid ties to civil defense. We didn't broadcast our arrival because it sometimes scares folks. We knocked because Mr. Vale's name is on our list of men who used to be called when things were less civilized than they are now. We are not here to take anything." A small hitch there, the kind of voice makes when it is a good voice doing bad choreography with a less good plan. "We are here to make sure the ridge is safe and that his legacy doesn't become a problem." "What kind of problem?" Riona asked. "Explosives," Sheriff Lane said, after a glance Riona could hear. "Unstable chemical stores. Fire hazards. Unregistered radio equipment drawing angry letters from the Spectrum folks. That kind of problem." Riona thought of the brown-wrapped boxes labeled with verbs instead of nouns. Water in high summer, fire when the town is thirsty. Heat. Light. She thought of the case in the deep room with the promise and the threat stamped onto its plate. Last resort and last rites. "He kept edges sharp," she said. "But he wasn't careless." "Didn't say he was," the sheriff answered mildly. "We're careful, too." The bad knee took a step and eased back. Riona imagined the man attached to it, the set of a jaw that knows the price of winter, hands that had helped push a neighbor's car out of drift and never called in the favor. "Here's what I can offer," Riona said. I can't open for you today. The systems are live, and they don't trust you yet. I don't either. She let the words land and listened for the flinch. There wasn't one. But I can show you something later, when the town needs it. Which, in case you haven't noticed, it will. Those clouds aren't just weather. They're a test paper. Silence. Sheriff Lane breathed slow. The ranger's radio clicked once, the quiet way a finger reads braille on a trigger guard without meaning to. Scuff heels shifted, impatient, then stopped because someone had taught them once that impatience gets you heard by the wrong thing first. Miss Calder, the ranger said carefully, the state would like to inventory. No, Riona said it kindly. You don't inventory intention. You respect it or you break it. And you can't afford to break what's inside this hill. She thought of the pump parts, the generator hearts, the spare lungs for a town. This place is a promise that survived on purpose. If you come back with a truck and paperwork, I'll make you coffee at the door while you read it. But you won't be taking anything. The bad knee creaked closer. I know where this road goes if we start it wrong, Sheriff Lane said, softer. I'll talk to him, he added, and that him had the shape of a ranger's shoulders when he stands too straight in the cold. We'll step back to the truck, warm up, grumble into the radio about how stubborn mechanics are, and then we'll go down the mountain. You'll wave from the high spot if you're feeling neighborly. But before we do that, tell me one thing. Did Gunnar leave you instructions? Riona thought of the note tucked over her heart and the way the words last resort and last rites had the taste of iron to them. He left me a sentence, she said. Keep what's needed alive. That sounds like him, the sheriff said. She could hear the small smile in it and the weight on either side of the smile. We'll be in town. If you need something, you won't find me on the scanner. You'll find me where you always find me when it's going to blow sideways. Diner, Riona guessed. Back booth, he said. The men outside shifted. The mountain gave back static and breath and then the sound of boots going down, one careful step at a time. The steady red held until the engine noises had slipped into distance and the scuff heel's impatience had no wood to beat itself against. Then the light went dark with the dignity of a sentinel that does not brag about a good watch. Riona stood with her ear on the door another half-minute anyway, counting heartbeats as if they belonged to the hill. When the cold started to settle under her nails, she pushed away, exhaled a breath she'd made too sharp to use, and went back to the workbench. She didn't write a list. She made one the way a machinist does when the blanks are already on the bench and the cuts have names. Tylark down for bad roads, straps, check. Fluids, topped. Tools, by feel and by habit. Build the pump on the bench, but leave the last bolts loose for the road, something always changes once you can smell the river. Pre-stage the generator cart at the pivot door, grease the casters so it feels like forgiveness. Carry the cedar block blade and the note even if you don't use them, weight matters. Work turned hours into something patient. She assembled the pump with her hands in a conversation with Gunnar's small labels and bigger ideas. The impeller housing had been designed by a man who had learned humility from leaks, each surface told you the direction water wanted to go. She lapped the seal faces with the kind of attention people think you give only to vows and children. When the parts became a machine, she leaned back and let the simple rightness of good fit run from her wrists to her jaw and unclench it. Wind found the ridge in the late afternoon and took hold of it with both hands. She felt the change come through the floor, vibration more than sound, pressure more than weather. Lark's hood throbbed a little in the draft from the vent. The lathe's apron clicked as if turning over a dream. Riona closed the workshop door to a slit and listened. Wind is an honest liar, it will tell you everything, including the things that are not your business, if you learn to translate its grammar. The storm arrived before sunset with rain that burned like a cold hand. It stuttered into sleet, then into snow that couldn't make up its mind. Lightning stitched the valleys and left the thread in, long, humming lines that made the hair on her arms pay attention. When the lights in the bunker dimmed and surged back, the generator downstairs coughed once like a warning and then kept its voice. She waited for the things storms bring on this mountain when the wind farms are awake and the lines are tired and the ground is hungry, fire. It didn't come. What came instead was the kind of quiet that is actually a prelude. Every animal holds its breath at once, and the rocks remember that they, too, used to be molten. The first call came from below in the valley. Not a knock. Not a radio. A bell. It was small and precise and rang twice and then once, not at the door but at the wall phone in the galley that had looked like decoration earlier because it belonged to a time when things were painted on purpose. Riona stared at it, then crossed the room with a feeling she refused to name, lifted the handset, and put her shoulder to the wall as if to be closer to the wire. Vale Place, she said, because it was truer than saying her own name. Girl, tell me you're where I think you are. The voice was old Harlan's, wound-like baling twine and just as capable of cutting if you grabbed it wrong. The lights went out at the feed store, and my son's running the generator on fumes, and the water pressures dropped to a gurgle. You don't happen to? I do, she said. I will. Listen, don't let anybody open hydrants. We'll feed the tanks from below. Send Webb to the river turnout with a pry bar and the long wrench. Have him wait. You're talking like you've done this before. I haven't, she said honestly. Gunnar has. Hang tight. She set the phone back into its bracket and found herself smiling because the phone had only 2 buttons, Town and Ridge. She pressed the first. The diner picked up on the second ring. Back booth, Sheriff Lane said. He had coffee in his voice, and a headache, and a not yet surrendered faith that people could be convinced instead of pushed. Don't send anyone up, she told him. Send them to the river turnout. The gate will be stubborn. Webb can persuade it. I'll meet them with a pump and a promise. You can get down off that mountain in this? Lark can, she said. She didn't add, and I need to see what the storm broke for myself. She hung up, tested the straps on the generator dolly, and rolled it to the pivot door. Lark had warmed once and wanted to warm again. She opened the big workshop door, and the cold came in like a polite dog that has never yet eaten off a table but has thought about it. Snow pinged off the fenders and turned to water. She shouldered the dolly and its heavy quiet toward Lark's tailgate, tilted, and lifted with legs that had hauled gearboxes and toddlers and sacks of dog food through shoulder seasons that had teeth. She didn't look at the deep room door as she passed. She felt it anyway, the way iron feels the company of other iron even if the two aren't touching. The red eye on the case behind that door was probably asleep. Or it was watching the way machines do, without judgment, keeping account of decisions like a ledger that someday has to be reconciled. By the time she chained the generator in the back and cinched it until the truck and the cargo were married, night had come with intent. The blast door opened to a world without edges. Snow and wind had put down a soft indictment upon everything between ridgeline and river. Riona drove into it anyway because the whole point of Lark was to make first steps possible, and the whole point of inheriting a thing is saying yes to its purpose. She put the nose into the night and felt the tires talk to the gravel and then to the hardpack and then to the places in between where gravity gets ideas. She kept the speed just below momentum and just above second thoughts. The headlights set flakes on fire in front of the glass. The wipers worked with the steady tenacity of a veteran's handwriting. Halfway down a switchback the wind shoved hard enough to move the light cone. She eased off and let the truck rewrite its grip. The radio on the bench behind her, she'd brought it on a hunch, crackled with the sheriff's slow voice and Webb swearing incompetent meter about a gate that had learned spite in a long-ago drought and had never forgotten it. When Riona reached the turnout, the river was visible only because the snow did a different dance above black water than it did above land. Webb's pickup sat skewed on the shoulder, chains humming. Webb himself loomed from the whiteness with the long wrench across his shoulders like the beam of a yoke rebuilt to fit a taller animal. You got religion up there? Webb asked as greeting. Because we're going to need a small one. I've got a pump and a reason, Riona said. Better than a prayer, Webb grinned. Gates stuck in its feelings. I talked nice. It called my mother names. Riona hopped down and followed him to the concrete box that governed water like a schoolteacher governs 15 6-year-olds and one very tall 12-year-old who is not strictly in the class but keeps wandering in. Snow had outlined the bolt heads in white halos. She brushed them clear with a glove, then set the wrench and made herself lighter than the tool. Webb set his hands above hers, heavier than the wrench, and made himself part of the ground. Lefty Lucy, he intoned in the liturgy of things that were never actually that simple. Lefty until your shoulder talks about your childhood, she corrected. The nut gave up with a sigh that could have been relief or foul language depending on your upbringing. They worked as one person with two bodies, and the gate climbed with the kind of surrender people write songs about when they manage it in themselves. While Webb coaxed the last yards of travel, she and Lark in the pump became a sentence. She set the cart, ran suction into the river with the intake weight kissing the current, ran discharge up the hillside where the feed line waited for a boost, and primed with the grace of a person who has never believed that air deserves rights inside a machine. The motor caught, the pump thumped, water rose. Somewhere in the dark, a municipal tank old enough to have opinions accepted it with a slow gratefulness. By the time the sheriff's unit slid into the turnout with a halo of snow like an old master painting around its light bar, the pump had found its song. Sheriff Lane rolled his window down. His nose was red. His eyes were steadier than the road. "Town's holding," he said without too much triumph in it. "Lights are hedgehogging. Power district says a main blew in the canyon, transformer took a holiday. They'll lie and say morning." "They can have morning," Riona said. "We'll have night." He looked at Lark, at the generator lashed behind the cab, at the pump, at Webb sanctimoniously communing with a gate. He looked at Riona last, not head to toe like a man taking inventory, but eyes to knuckles like a person measuring whether the person in front of him is the kind that breaks or bends when it matters. "You're not going to like this part," he said. "Try me." Brooks called it in. He did what he said he would. Kept it calm. But State got ears and hunger. A vehicle without plates, he nodded at Lark's unregistered honesty, and an old grid ping from a veteran's line, and now there's a supervisor with a different tone coming up tomorrow in daylight, and with him the kind of gentleman who prints his authority on embossed paper. "Then we do what we can before tomorrow," Riona said. "And we make good enough so obvious it looks expensive to interrupt." He huffed. "I like that." He tapped his temple in the direction of the ridge. "That place up there, if I asked you straight, what would you call it?" "A machine that turns fear into tools," she said, and only realized how true that was after she said it. They held the river 3 hours while the storm broke its courage into 1,000 cold pieces on the valley's low roofs. Webb went home when the tank sang full and the pump's note shifted to say so. The sheriff followed Riona back as far as the first switchback, then stopped because law is places it belongs and places it learns how to go quiet. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. Lark climbed the mountain like a patient animal who knows the trail by heart even if it has never walked it. The wind had changed its tactics, it was asking for truce. Riona drove into it anyway, because wind does not get votes. At the blast door she killed the engine and let the night return to itself. Snow hissed on steel. The mountain sounded pleased with itself in a way mountains rarely admit. When she swung the door shut, the indicator by the conduit blinked once like a good dog settling in at the foot of the bed. Sleep in the bunks was a duty performed, not a luxury enjoyed. She lay on her side, boots off but near, and watched the dim light that was only the idea of light get slightly less theoretical near morning. When she woke, the world smelled mended. She made coffee in the enamel pot and drank it with her hands wrapped around the cup and the cup wrapped around an idea older than any cup: heat belongs where we are softest. By 10, the storm had done what storms do, become a story told at counters with elbows on them. By 10:30, a white SUV that had never been mud deeper than a fairground parking lot in its life was laboring up the county road, and behind it, a truck that had held the weight of 3 refrigerators, a box of regrets, and a filing cabinet that still smelled like an office where nobody laughed. Riona watched them from the slit above the blast door, then went back to the workshop and chose not to be impressed by anything invented after 1988. She didn't wait for the knock. She opened the door and stood in it, framed by concrete and the kind of steel that only answers to real questions. Sheriff Lane stood with Brooks. The supervisor had that good coat men buy when they think they will be cold but believe they can negotiate with weather. The gentleman with the embossed paper smiled in a way that had the word inevitable hiding in its pockets. "Miss Calder," the supervisor began, hand out, palm forward like a flag that had been washed too often. "Appreciate you meeting us." "I didn't," she said. "I met him." She nodded to the sheriff. "The rest of you are visitors until you do something neighborly." The gentleman's smile got steadier, as if it had been told to try a little harder. "I'm Harold Pierce, State Assets and Emergency Oversight. We don't want to take anything. We want to help you secure and deploy something this ridge has that we didn't know about. What you did for the town last night, that's exactly the kind of cooperative effort we—" "Pierce," Sheriff Lane said mildly. "Start with please." "Please," Pierce amended, and the word sounded like a tool he didn't like using because it never did anything dramatic. Riona looked at Brooks. His face had the expression of a man who had chosen to be a bridge and had discovered that bridges get walked on by both sides. She felt something unchain inside her that had no poetry in it, only function. "Here's how this goes," she said. "You will not enter without me. You will not record without asking. You will not touch anything with labels unless I unscrew it first. You will not inventory as if this were a pantry you stocked. You will observe a working system doing what it was built to do, keep what's needed alive. If any of that is a problem, the door stays shut and I help the town some other way." Pierce spread his hands. "We'll abide. We don't need to own it to value it." He almost made it sound believable. Riona stepped back and let the mountain have the space to decide whether these men belonged in its throat. It didn't throw them back out. She took that as consent the way you do with cats in places built by stubborn kindness. They saw the workshop the way tourists see a glacier, off first, then a worry that their shoes were wrong for this. Pierce asked too many questions in the syntax of ownership. Brooks asked a few and then stopped and listened right, eyes on the lathes oil cups the way a man studies someone else's elderly father's hands to gauge how they're really doing. Sheriff Lane asked none. He looked at the wall phone as if it had rung every winter of his life and saved his bacon. "Where does that go?" Pierce asked finally, pointing to the narrow passage and the sign that said "Think First." The steady red light was off now. The case in the deep room knew when to hold its breath. "It goes past where you'll be comfortable," Riona said. "And where I won't go yet." "You went once," he said, like a man putting a piece down on a checkers board because at least something should move. "I counted doors," she said. "That's all." He looked like a man who had not been told no by a door in a long time. "Miss Calder, we're on the same side." "Are we?" she asked. "Which side is that?" "The side that keeps people from freezing," he said. "From thirsting. From doing what people do when their needs get loud." "Then do it," she said, and led them back to the door, back out into the fresh cold. She pointed down valley. "We'll put a unit at the school by 1. You bring extension cords you wouldn't be ashamed to use on your own house. You bring diesel that hasn't been sitting in a plastic can since the last eclipse. You bring volunteers who can lift with their legs and obey instructions given the first time. We'll be neighbors under a roof. You don't need a checklist for that. You need manners." Pierce's smile forgot its job. Brooks' mouth twitched like a man who had been handed a reason to be grateful. The sheriff leaned in. "The diners got chili on. If you're going to talk like that in my county, you better do it with a bowl in front of you." They dispersed with more grace than Riona had expected and less than the mountain thought polite. After they left, she stood with her hand on the steel and felt the cold soak into her skin until what was under the skin agreed to be steady again. Then she went to work. By noon, Lark was loaded for a small migration. The generator rode like a promise. The pump rode like a memory. The drawers she'd chosen rode like the difference between panic and improvisation. She drove down into a town that had learned how to be grateful without making a parade out of it. That was the thing about places like this, they said thank you by showing up when you needed brake lines bled or a porch roof put back on after a stupid wind. The school's foyer became a small sun by 2 p.m., space heaters singing harmony with a generator that had found itself doing what it had dreamt of doing in its crate. The kids asked better questions than Pierce had. One of them had a wrench in his pocket he kept taking out just to ask if it was the right one for anything that was about to happen. Sheriff Lane walked the halls like a farmer checks fences, not because he expects a cow to be plotting but because the habit keeps both fences and cows honest. Brooks carried cord the right way, over his shoulder, with respect for what a trip hazard does to a whole day. Pierce showed up with a clipboard and a red pen and the small look of a man surprised to find himself behaving well. He kept glancing at Riona's hands. It took her a half hour to realize why. He had never seen a person move their fingers like they were listening to a machine in a room and themselves all at once. "Miss Calder," he said finally, late afternoon, turning the windows into pale coins, "if I were a worse man, I would have brought a seizure order. If I were a better one, I would have come up alone yesterday and asked if you needed a hand carrying wood. I'm trying to be whichever kind I can still be." "That's a lot of words to say you'd like to look at the thing behind that door," Riona said. He laughed once, and the laugh made him look younger. "Yes." She wrapped the cord on her arm without looking. "The deep room isn't a weapon, Pierce. It's a pantry for verbs, not nouns. But there's a box in it that isn't for triage or for keeping the soup hot. It's for when somebody tries to turn this into a story about force. That's not today." "What is it?" he asked. "A chance I don't want to need," she said. Her hand found the envelope over her heart without consulting her brain. "Gunnar trusted me with last resort and last rites. Today is first resort and a lot of people eating chili with red ears." They stood in that knowledge and let it be big enough for both of them to feel small under. Then the lights blinked in a way that wasn't the generator and wasn't weather. The children in the hall stopped. The heaters paused and remembered how to exhale. The sheriff stepped out from the nurse's office with a look that said the scanner had just coughed up something nobody wanted to hear. "Brush fire East Ridge," he said. "Power lines down by Canyon Road." Wynn woke up again with something to prove. "If it hops the gully, it'll run for the junkyard and then its tires and God help us." God, a skeptic, shrugged. Riona didn't. "Webb," she said. "Get the VFD to the river. We'll feed the tank again and then I'll bring the second pump to the hydrant at Miller's on Canyon." "Pierce," she surprised herself putting his name where a door could go, "if you've got hands you trust, send them to the East Ridge cut with saws and eyes. Sheriff, tell the folks at the shelter we may draft them for a bucket line if the hydrant coughs." They moved because the valley had taught them that if you move fast enough with your hands pointed in the same direction, even fear gets drafted and stops slowing you down. Lark carried the pump like a stretcher. The generator stayed at the school and learned what it felt like to be essential. The wind found a way around the diner and made the sign rattle its vowels. At the canyon, the air had a different color. Smoke does that, it writes its own weather. The brush fire wasn't yet a wall. It was a handwriting in the dry grass, fast cursive. Riona and Webb and 3 volunteers set the pump and fed the hydrant until it stopped sounding thirsty. The VFD hit the first flare and knocked it down with the satisfying discourtesy of cold water meeting hot arrogance. Then the wind decided to rewrite the plan. It came sideways down the cut and threw embers into the junkyard with a gambler's flick. Tires smoldered. The sound they made when they remembered flame was like a choir that had been taught the wrong songs. The smoke from them went black and mean and full of chemicals that made the back of the throat vote against democracy. Riona blinked the sting out and did math nobody had ever taught her. Lark had torque and stubbornness in a winch. The junkyard fences had history and barbed wire and a regard for property that did not extend to physics. The deep room had a case that was not for this. The shelves had something that could be. "Webb," she called over the siren in the sheriff's throat and the long low note the fire sang when it changed keys. "You ever wish for a curtain between a thing and the thing that wants it?" "All the time," he said. "Birthdays. Bad dates. Bad politics." She grinned despite the smoke. "Then get me tarps. Any. All. Blue, green, ugly. We're going to make the wind say please." He stared, then looked at Lark, then at the fence line, then at the low ground beyond it where the gully tried to remember its old river name. "Oh," he said, enlightened profanity. "Oh, that could work," she said, and they made it work. Lark pulled chain link down with a squeal that sounded like an argument losing its last point. Volunteers ran tarps like flags of an odd army. Webb hammered stakes like a man whose debts had come due and he intended to pay them in full before supper. They slung 100 feet of ugly blue above the gully and weighted it with anything that wasn't on fire yet. When the wind tried to shove the embers across, it hit blue and lost its nerve. The tarps bellied and snapped and did a job no tarp had ever been sold for. Behind them, the VFD hit hot rubber with foam that made chemistry recant. It held. The fire chose a different sentence, walked back into brush it could understand, and burned in a way men could read and write an ending to. By night, the town had water, power enough for warmth, and one less story to tell about loss. People who had been angry in the morning found themselves handing mugs across lines to people they'd argued with about fences last summer. Sheriff Lane sat on the diner step with a blanket around his shoulders and looked like the kind of tired that is its own prayer. Riona drove Lark back up the mountain slow, thinking of tarps and wind and how you can teach a machine to do something nobody imagined for it if you respect its first name before you give it a nickname. The blast door swallowed her in her headlights. The bunker breathed her back. In the workshop, the deep room's door waited with mountain patience. She stood in front of it and told herself what the day had already said out loud: you don't open that box because you're thrilled by the idea of a secret. You open it when the day asks you a question you cannot answer with anything else. She ate bread and beans and the end of a jar of pickles Gunnar had put away with the care of a man who believes vinegar belongs in serious conversations. Then she slept for a scatter of hours, boots off but near. She dreamed of a river with teeth and a town with hands and a box with a red eye that was also a heartbeat. Dawn raised its pale eyebrows and found her already standing in the deep room with the blade in her hand. The red light wasn't lit. The cold was honest. She slipped the blade into the slot on the case and didn't turn it yet. "Tell me the truth," she said to the metal like she would to a seized bearing. "Are you a weapon or a will?" She turned it. The case recognized a hand it had been waiting for and clicked with relief. Inside lay no gun. No explosive. No coiled serpent of wire and intent. Inside lay paper, heavy and careful. There was also a small device that could have been a radio or a recorder or a thing someone had built when he didn't like what was on the market. It wore an on-off that had been touched a few times and then left alone. On top lay a letter in Gunnar Vale's hand. "If you are reading this, I'm not fond of the drama in that, but I'm fonder of the truth, and the truth looks the same no matter what it's wearing. You'll have learned by now that the point of all this was not to build a shelter from the world but to build a way to meet it with your head up. There are men who will come to you with paper and say that your hands should stop moving and sign instead. Some of them are honest and will want what's best and be wrong about what that is. Some of them have been given a job that lets them forget what they were good at before. This box is for both kinds. Inside you will find records. Not of war. Of water. Go to the device and press its green. Listen once. Then walk down to town and put the paper on the table at the diner and say the words that you will hear me say. After you do that, the rest of the deep room will make more sense. Keep what's needed alive. That includes the truth." GV. Riona didn't sit. She didn't drink water or turn the heater up. She pressed the green. The device woke gently, as if the person who made it had loved the feeling of listening. Gunnar Vale's voice filled the deep room in a way that made her fall in love with silence for having made this possible. He spoke like a man who had practiced not wasting other people's time. "Date stamped," he said, and he stamped it with the formality of a man who had been taught that dates are what hold stories in place. 5 summers in a row they took more than their share. The Wind Farm Consortium. When the drought was at its thinnest, they pumped at night from the old diversion when nobody watched. I watched. I made a machine watch for me when my bones wouldn't stand cold water any longer. When the river ran shy of cattle and the fields went to plead with the sky, the consortium ran the turbine wash and told us it was for maintenance. The lines they broke with wires so they could get the insurance to pay to fix the thing that would win them the lawsuit when someone would come to sue. A boy drowned that second summer because the flow changed when it shouldn't. I wrote the numbers down. I put them here because paper in a safe is better than anger at a funeral. If you are hearing this, you are the person who will say it out loud when it matters. He paused only to breathe. Paper rustled. Sheriff, I'm sorry for making you learn it here. You wouldn't have let me keep quiet. Miss Calder, I'm sorry for making you carry it. You carry things already. But you also know when to put them down in the right place. The device clicked itself off like a man closing a door gently behind a guest who will come again. Riona stood with the weight of the paper in her hands and the weight of the hill behind her. She was not weaponized. She was deputized by a dead man with good penmanship. At the diner, people made space for her because the way a person walks into a place can be read by anyone who has ever known winter. Sheriff Lane rose without theater. Brooks sat straighter. Pierce looked like a man who had come to throw his weight and had discovered that his shoes were on a floor he had not earned the right to scuff. Riona put the papers on the table and said, he watched. He recorded. He kept the numbers. The water that went the wrong way went on purpose. Pierce did not touch the paper first. The sheriff did. He read without moving his lips. He swore once. Brooks looked like a man whose opinion of the river had been naive and now was adult and still loved it. Pierce reached last and read like he had been warned this would hurt his teeth and did it anyway because he needed the ache to teach him something. Names, the sheriff said softly. Dates. Flow rates. And a maintenance schedule that matches the times the taps went dry on the east side. Jesus. I'll take this to the AG, Pierce said. The words came clean. I don't know where it dies after it leaves my hands, but it won't die here. It won't die at all, Brooks said. Not with a town in on the reading. Not with a woman who can turn a mountain into a wrench, Webb added, appearing with coffee he hadn't paid for because in a storm somebody pays for you if you were seen at the river when the gate stuck. Riona exhaled. She had not known she'd been holding breath for 2 winters. She sat, because the human body is wiser than pride by about an inch. There's more, she said. Not of this kind. But of the kind you can deploy without permission. Heat. Water. Light. Work. Hardware for days when the people in charge of paper get tired and need soup. Then we'll write our own paper, Sheriff Lane said. A community agreement. Not to own it. To respect it. To leave it where it belongs and come when the phone rings. He glanced at Pierce. You can sign it, too, if you want to look at your embossed letter in the mirror and like your reflection. Pierce surprised himself by half smiling. Send it to my office, he said. I'll sign it before I send it to you. I don't need to be there to be visible. It wasn't resolution. It was trajectory. It was the line a welded seam takes across 2 pieces of steel and makes them one if the puddle is right. Winter kept its mouth for 2 more weeks. The generator at the school wrote its own love story with the extension cords. The pump learned the river's moods and stopped being surprised when Webb sang to it. The deep room learned to trust footsteps. The mountain began to smell not like secrets but like work. On a Wednesday when the wind carried sawdust and not snow, Riona stood with her hand on Lark's fender and watched as a convoy of small things left the bunker and drove into the valley's day. A box of grommets rode with the auto shop class, they would become lessons and then become parts. A coil of hose rode with the volunteer fire. A crate of lamps with weird bases rode with the woman who ran the care home. The old people would have soft light tonight. None of it looked like power. All of it was. Later that afternoon, she took the blade out again and went to the deep room. The case sat open and unashamed. Under the papers and the device lay one more thing she hadn't seen because her hands had not needed to yet, a folded flag in a small wooden box with 2 names carved into it. Gunnar Vale. A second name she knew from the bench behind the feed store, Mitchell Harrow, the quiet man with the mended jacket who had always paid an exact change and had always looked toward the ridge as if it had something of his inside it. She did not open the wooden box. She lifted the flag and held it with the respect people teach their hands for things that have wrapped both joy and disaster. A note lay beneath. Last rites. If nobody else remembers, do this: take us up to the high place above the switchback when the wind is the kind that tells the truth. Say our names. Don't make a speech. Let the mountain have us with a sentence and a breath. Then go down and fix something that will not fix itself. She folded the note back down and knew what day she would choose and what words she would say. She put the flag in the cedar chest in the bunkroom where blankets lived. The case looked smaller without it and somehow not diminished. The next morning, Pierce came without a clipboard. He brought a satchel with sand in the bottom of it because it had been set down on a lot of different floors and had learned to be humble. He set the satchel on the workbench and stepped back like a man approaching a dog he wants to make friends with. Attorney General says the flow numbers will be read in a room with microphones. It won't be quiet. It will be tiresome. It will not be ignored. The consortium's counsel called me. He asked if we had any leverage up here. I told him we had a mechanic who understood leverage and would use it if he gave her a reason. Then I told him a story about tarps and wind. He looked apologetic and pleased at the same time. I hope you don't mind being famous for that one. I mind everything that isn't work, Riona said. But I mind less if it keeps hands on what's needed. He nodded, and for a long minute they just stood in Gunnar's workshop and listened to it be what it was. Then he said, almost shy, I was the kid who took things apart and couldn't put them back together. My mother prayed I'd become an accountant so the things I broke would be on paper. You can still learn, Riona said. Paper breaks, too. You might as well do it honestly with a wrench. He laughed, and in the sound was something that felt like a first-time piece. Teach me what those labels mean, he said, pointing at the drawers. Not the words. The assumptions behind them. She did. She taught him that drawers labeled by function instead of type mean you expect to be interrupted by reality and want to be ready. She taught him the trick of listening with fingertips to a bearing race because your ears lie and your hands do not. She taught him that torque is not force, it is persuasion. She taught him that the mountain had been threaded the same way. That Sunday, they carried the flag in the small box to the high place above the switchback. Sheriff Lane, Brooks, Webb, Mrs. Harlan, 3 kids from the auto shop class who had earned a place just by not dropping the lamp bases all week. They stood where the wind is allowed to say the last word and used their inside voices anyway because grief is not something you shout. Riona said their names. Gunnar Vale. Mitchell Harrow. She did not make a speech. She let the wind do it. She breathed and let that be enough. Brooks took his hat off. Sheriff Lane looked at the valley the way men look at things they like better now than they used to. The kids were crying and pretending not to. Webb cried and didn't pretend. Mrs. Harlan patted his arm like he was a grandchild or a tractor that keeps starting on the first crank despite age. After, they went down and fixed the thing that would not fix itself, the fence at Miller's that had been walked down by the fire trucks and had not yet learned to stand again. It took an hour. It took nails. It took 4 sets of hands and 2 sets of opinions. It was perfect when it was done because it would do its job again and did not care about compliments. On the way back up the ridge, Riona turned the wall phone to Ridge and listened to it ring into her own ear for the pleasure of knowing a system worked even when it was for nothing more than the human joy of making noise. She set the cedar blade beside the case as if returning a tool to its place after a job. She wrote a new label in Gunnar's neat, spare style and put it on an empty drawer, Agreements, Community. It wasn't paper. It was the habit of keeping promises in a place where you could find them and take them out when you needed to remember what shape they were. That night, she sat on the workshop floor with her back to Lark's tire and the good kind of tired singing its slow hymn through her bones. The bunker's lights hummed. The generator below turned the same way the pump above had. The mountain did not tell her secrets. It told her that she was not an heir to a pile of things. She was the next hand on a tool. She thought of Gunnar's sentence. Keep what's needed alive. She added, quietly, where only the lathe could hear her and perhaps approve, and teach it to others. Weeks later, when spring decided to try on the valley like a dress and check its hem in every window, a letter arrived on her bench. It was on embossed paper because some habits die slow and should be allowed a dignified exit. It was signed by the AG and Pierce and the sheriff and Webb and Mrs. Harlan and 3 kids with lamp-base fingerprints. It said, in words that had been dragged back from legalese into English, that the bunker was not a state asset but a community instrument, that access would be governed by need and trust, that Riona Calder would be the first and last key, that the deep room would remain deep, and that if anyone tried to make it otherwise, they'd meet a county with tarps and stubbornness and the kind of mechanic you only get when a mountain decides it's ready to tell the truth about itself. She framed it not because she liked frames but because sometimes paper deserves to be given a hard surface to sit on so it stops curling its corners up like a cat when a door opens. Then she went back to work, because that was what the story had been all along, not a mystery solved by a twist but a labor done well and shared. Riona drove Lark out onto the switchback that afternoon and parked at the high spot where you can see everything and be seen by nothing that wasn't invited. The wind pushed her hair out of her eyes and back again like it was already telling summer where to find her. She watched the town and the small dignity of its roofs and the pale thread of the river with its own ideas and the wind farm turning prayers into small electricity. She thought of last rites and found that they were also first rites if you do them right. You say a name, you keep a promise, you fix a thing that needs a hand. She thought of last resort and knew it is often a first kindness if you have had the sense to prepare. She touched the envelope in her pocket and pressed it flat the way you press a crease into a good list. The deep rooms read I never lit again in anger. It came on sometimes when she tested alarms or when Brooks brought a recruit up to teach him how to be less afraid of places that make honest noises. But the bunker did not become a museum. It stayed what it had been asked to be, a machine for verbs. When travelers stopped by the feed store to ask about the ridge, Mrs. Harlan told them the truth they could hold without dropping. A good man left something useful, and a better woman made it more useful still, and the town decided that was their favorite kind of math. On evenings when the weather put on a show, Riona would flip the switch that made the wall phone ring 2 gentle notes, one for town and one for ridge, and she would sit and listen to them fade. She would think of Gunner's voice on the device, steady, unsentimental, inhabited by purpose and the gentleness of people who have learned to whisper to metal. She would think of Sheriff Lane's laugh when the tarps held because there is a joy in being surprised by your own good idea. She would think of Pierce with grease under his nails and legal dust on his shoes and the look of a man who has found a better way to be brave. And sometimes, when the wind came straight through the cut and you could hear the river working without seeing it, she would stand in the doorway where cold air made its case and say out loud into the evening, "We kept what was needed alive." The mountain always agreed with her. Not in words. In the way the steel felt when her hand was on it, like potential, like history, like the kind of quiet that comes after a storm when you can finally hear the small machines you've made humming on behalf of people you love. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.